Hello, and welcome to my session using mentor text, getting students to read closely, think deeply, and write purposefully about text. Today, what I'm going to ask you to get is make sure you have at least 3 different colored markers or pens and 2 pieces of notebook paper. If you don't have 3 different colors of markers or pens, it's okay. We don't have to color code. I will show you how to code what we are doing in a different way using some shapes. So while you're getting that, I'm going to talk to you why I use mentor text. Well, the mentor text we're going to read today, Henry's Freedom Box, I use it to build background knowledge about slavery and the Underground Railroad. I use it to help students make connections to a historical fiction novel that I read called Riding Freedom by Pam Munoz Ryan. Why? Well, 1, it's a picture book. 2, it really helps to be able to go back into a picture book. And for this one, I do have enough copies to do partner work with this book. And it's just something that I use for mini lessons, to model good writing, to make connections between books and text. Students are really going to make connections, in this case, between our main character of Henry, and then in Riding Freedom, there's another slave character that has escaped slavery. And so character connection between text. And so I use it to facilitate rich connections and discussions about books and to share some amazing literature. So you would be surprised as how students start connecting various points of literature and making connections in ways that I didn't think 2 books could connect, but they do. So that's how we get students to think deeply about literature. Now, Henry's Freedom Box. What I like to do is I like to find a video of the author reading the book if possible. Because who better to read the book the way it is intended, including the expression. And I want you to really watch Ellen Levine's face as she reads this book, because you can see the expression. You can really feel her powerful words come through because she's the one that's reading the book. Normally, again, I would let students, 1, enjoy this mentor text the first time I introduce it, meaning I would play it or read it from beginning to end without any interruptions, without any questions, just show how excited I am to read this book, to share this book, and again, to read it from beginning to end with no questions or not stopping, to enjoy a good piece of literature, an amazing piece of literature. Today, however, because of time, and you're an adult or adults, I am going to have you take out that first piece of paper. And during the reading, normally I might stop and give hints and guidance and scaffold. Hey, we're going to write down a few words. I'm going to suggest this word, or you might want to use this word. Today, all on your own, because I feel that we will be way cramped for time if I keep stopping the reading. So, on that piece of paper, I want you to write any maybe repeated words that you hear, any words that you may not know. Of course, you might write down places, characters, something exciting that might happen, maybe feelings that you're feeling throughout the story. And after that, we will talk about how using questions and discussions hit all of these reading literature standards for Pennsylvania. So I'm going to let Ellen take over, and again, make sure you are writing throughout the story, just words, and they don't have to be organized. Mine are always very random on a piece of paper, and that's okay.
Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at a new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted the tobacco. His heart twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves was tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy, too, was gone. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next morning at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. "What if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready," he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railroad clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat, headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Why don't we move that box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, now on his left, and suddenly right side up. "What do you think is in here?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I am mail," thought Henry, "but not the kind they imagine." Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." At last, Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown.
Okay, I hope you really enjoyed the story of Henry Box Brown. But what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to put that paper to the side, and we'll get back to it a little bit later. Before I forget, the one thing I would like to mention to you is the importance of story maps. Why? Well, all students need to understand basic elements of a story to be able to dig deeper into the text. They need to understand that a story starts out with the exposition, which, again, no need, you can bring that up later. Usually in 4th grade, I say, hey, this is the exposition of the story. In the exposition, we learn about the characters or introduced to the characters and setting. As we go up that rising action, we soon learn about the problem one of the characters or a unit of characters is going to face. Then we're going to usually have 3 tries at solving that problem and coming up with a solution at the end, and that is how the story is resolved. Now, whatever story map you feel comfortable for your grade level, your favorite story map, that's perfectly fine. Use what you want, use what you are comfortable with, but make sure the students are understanding the story structure of a piece of text, in this case, a piece of literature. Which brings us to the reading literature standard. Students read and respond to works of literature with an emphasis on comprehension, making connections among ideas and between texts with a focus on textual evidence. Now, I really want to get away from having to always say, did you cite your text evidence? Don't worry. Remember to cite your text evidence. I say that a lot, and I realize if we're having rich discussions supporting what we have to say, supporting our claims with text evidence in discussions, and it just becomes habit, that also starts to, again, fade away, that I have to keep reminding students. Now, I think by the end of this session, you are going to be surprised that through discussion, you're going to be able to get students to think so much more critically of what they're reading at a very early age. And when that happens, the students are going to understand the text because they're going to be immersed in how the text works, in what the text says and what the text means. And there we go. So if you notice, the pink says, what does the text say? How does the text work? And what does the text mean? Now, let's look at the standards really quickly. And probably the most beneficial thing that I have found in this whole entire thing on SAS through the PDE website is looking at the vertical view of standards. Now, if you notice, if I look down here, it goes A, B, C, D, and that's what we're going to kind of break apart those standards today. And the other thing, if you notice, is if I keep clicking, it goes down to those lower grades and those expectations at the lower grades. If I actually click here, let's do grade 1. Here we have our standard area, and then that standard itself, which that 3 would be we are reading literature 1A. So this is first grade and this is A. So the only thing different would be in 4th grade or 5th grade is instead of 1A, it would be 4A or 5A. Only thing different. So one of the other things is the assessments, materials, and resources, an assessment builder. I can tell you for the younger grades, there's still not much, and it seems like for the last 5, 6 or more years, I keep saying there's not much. In the older grades, when you click on assessments, a lot of times we can do that. Now there is one for first grade on Plan of Garden, but when you look at assessments, a lot of the older assessments are just from the PSSA samplers. So probably the most important, I think, most valuable part of SAS is this vertical viewer and taking a look at how we build from kindergarten to 5th grade. And we do that by making sure we are addressing those standards. So goodbye, SAS. And speaking of standards, oops, this one didn't get fixed. That's okay, because it shows what I'm going to have you do. So with that second piece of paper, you are going to fold that paper so that I have 8 boxes, or you have 8 boxes. So obviously we could fold it hot dog, and then in half once, and then in half again, and half once, and half again, and let's get those 8 blocks. Now when you unfold your paper, normally I tell my students that, let's see if I can draw. Oh, let's see. I tell my students, go ahead and go here and go here. And that's terrible because I don't have any creases, but to go ahead and mark the creases so that you have distinct blocks. When you're done with that, I want you to go ahead and make your paper, or not make your paper, or write on your paper where it says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, so make it look like mine. If you don't have colored pencils or markers or colored anything, then do you see how I put a star around the A? So A, B, C could have a star around it. Come on. And then if you wanted to, D, E, F, let's say, could have a different shape around it. So let's say D, E, F, you wanted to have, oh, where's the cloud shape? You could have a cloud shape there. Shape fill, shape fill, nothing. And that could be your D, E, F. And then your G and your H could have a different shape around it. So you could do a triangle if you wanted. However you want to code those for yourself. I color coded so it's easy for you to see. Now, as we talk about those standards, I'm going to say there's an H, I, and J. I and J are acquiring and using vocab, which I'm not going to get to today, how to acquire and use necessarily vocab. We are actually just going to talk about vocab in terms of authors, craft, and structure. So there's 2 more, and then the last one actually in this, within the standards for reading literature, is complex text. And I'm just going to say this, complex text is considered grade level text. Students should be exposed to grade level text even if they're not reading at grade level. And there are many, many different articles and research about the importance of getting students or making students or engaging students in complex text, grade level text, and why that is important. But we're not going to talk about that today because I could talk about things like that forever. But we are going to fill in the standards by looking at some questions that are typical questions that might be asked of, come on, slideshow, of a story. Play from current slide. There we go. So this actually is page 1 of the book. And if you notice, I have something that when we talk about writing purposefully, this is a great way to get students to fill in answers. Sometimes people call it closed format. I call it a frame sentence. Henry was a blank. So what if you get the word Henry was a boy? That's true, Henry was a boy. But what did the author in our story call Henry? So I'm going to go back and reread that part, which is a strategy. Let's see, it says Henry was a slave. So you know what? I'm going to put the word slave in there, S-L-A-V-E. Now, what did I just do? Well, I did use text, details from the text, so that's key ideas and details. And what did I ask? I asked a literal question. And when you ask literal questions, it's text analysis, and it's going to go where that B is on your paper. So you're going to write text analysis, literal, and inferential. And we're going to come to that inferential question later. And if you don't get this all down, I have a screen at the very end that will show you everything I'll put together. Let's try another one. But Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see how those leaves are blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. So this comes from page 2. And a question might be asked, what piece of figurative language is used in this text? Now, if you take a look, or if you haven't addressed figurative language, or similes aren't addressed, that's okay. This just could be a question for a specific grade level, like grade number level 4 or 3. Now, if I look here, there's the word like, and slave children are being compared to leaves from trees. They, meaning slave children, are torn from the trees, leaves are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. So right now, the author is using a simile to compare slave children to leaves, and that would be F. So where you have letter F, you are going to write vocabulary or vocab, and you're going to write figurative language. So another piece of text that I might put on the board or might read is, but Nancy was worried. Her master has lost a great deal of money. I'm afraid he will sell our children, she said. Henry sat very still. A question that might ask is what can you infer from Henry just sitting there? And I want to point out that word infer. You see that word infer? It would be B, because that's an inferential question for text analysis, literal and inferential. But I want to make sure that you realize that even with kindergarten, first grade, we're going to start using some of the correct terms and vocabulary for reading, and infer is a big one. And you're going to maybe start off with, when you infer, you make some guesses based on your previous experience, so that's that background or schema, and you make some guesses based on your background and what you know. And a lot of times it's what you read, but did you know you can read someone's facial expressions as well? So I bet you really know when your mom or dad might be upset with you, and you can make an inference and you can infer that mom or dad is upset for a specific reason. So language, use the correct terms with your students. All right, so this picture just happens to go with the other piece of text that was on my last slide. Henry knew they were lucky. Henry sat very still. What does the illustration show about Henry and his family? Well, they're lucky. They're happy. They look happy. I can tell Henry's happy. Again, I can infer by looking at that picture. It shows G. Now, G is kind of odd. In terms of, it kind of goes with what does the text mean in integration of knowledge. So I'm integrating what I know and the text and the illustration. So G is sources of information. So that is just text and visual integration that an author does to help give meaning. Of course, we're going to match the picture to what you're saying. We do that when a child writes or a child draws, and we write for them. Who is telling the story? So when we talk about who is telling the story, from what point of view is the story being told? And that is letter D. And one thing that I asked you to do was look at Ellen Levine's facial expressions when she was reading the story. One thing is reading out loud with expression helps students distinguish point of view towards someone or something. So a lot of times when we think of point of view, we think of first person, and I'm sorry, that is letter D, POV, point of view, narrator. Who is the narrator? But we think of first person, third person, and we think of those pronouns that go with first person like I. But we also need to think about point of view towards someone or something, and point of view, what is the author's point of view? Author's point of view is really important when you talk about informational text, because obviously authors can have some bias. Actually, I'm pretty sure in literature, in stories, you can see some of their author's bias in that too. All right, so who is telling the story? Letter D, point of view. Compare two versions of the story of Henry Box Brown. There's one called Freedom Song, the story of Henry Box Brown. So when you compare two versions, when you compare two stories, when you compare an author and two books that author has written, or two different authors who have written like this on the same subject, it is H. Again, what does the text mean? And that is H, text analysis and compare and contrast. We're going to pull on those key ideas and details. Don't worry, those haven't gone away, because all of a sudden we go back to that big idea of the reading literature standard, and it is that text evidence portion. How does Henry change throughout the story? Now, these are questions that happen all the time. We talk about a character's traits. We talk about Henry's thoughts, his actions, everything about that character. And it would be C, literary elements. So character change is a big one. And a lot of times we're going to ask, that comes up, character change leads and connects with a theme of the story. So how does the character's thoughts, actions, and words support a theme of the story? Or so convey a theme. So that's where you start mixing in and making things a little bit more complex. And in fourth grade, those are types of questions that a student would have to write one of those big TDAs on. Next one, write a summary of Henry's Freedom Box. Remember, in fourth grade, you start writing summaries using those key ideas and details. So that would be A. For A, I want you to write theme, message, summarize. When we write a summary, and I'm going to show you that actually in a couple later slides, we want to remember, though, the build up to this summary is being able to retell a story in sequential order. Making sure you use those keywords, like before or in the beginning, in the middle, and the end, and getting all those literary elements into a retell. What event happened after Henry poured the oil of vitriol on his hand? That would be E. Again, text structure. If you notice, I said happened after, we're looking at, well, did this happen in the beginning, middle, end of the story? So E for text structure, I want you to put BME for beginning, middle, end text structure, because guess what? Literature only has a beginning, middle, end. That's what stories have. In informational text, this is the same. E is still text structure for informational text. However, you have 5 different text structures in informational text. In literature, you have 1, which is beginning, middle, end. All right, so no matter how you decided to categorize with shapes or with colors, here we have, what does the text say? Key ideas and details are A, B, C. How does the text work? So how does the text work is author's craft and structure. You have D, E, F. G, H, what does the text mean? That is knowledge and integration, or integration of knowledge. So let's talk about some skills. Now let's work on the skill of summarizing. Get out your notebook paper with all of those important words on them that you wrote down. And here are some of my words. Now I'm going to show you here. What I want to do is, I'll get that a little bit bigger for you. Something I like to do is play with words. So I had you write down words. Here's your new word box, and we're going to play with and manipulate some words. Now, if you're saying, oh, my students can't read those words, well, then make pictures to go with the words. And so you're going to make pictures. Now, some words I can use emojis, such as sad, or if I happen to be working with the CVC and short vowels, there we go. That's a great opportunity to just incorporate that into the word sad and practice those foundational skills. However, words and phrases. So I got to watch my time on words and phrases because I could go on and on and on discussing how some of these words make connections. So I'm going to take Nancy, Henry. I can automatically start thinking about making a connection there, and Dr. Smith. So I might ask a student why I would put those 3 characters together. Or I might not even tell them they're characters because I want them to say, oh, Mrs. Wallace, you put characters together. Well, yes, I did. So tell me about those characters. Well, Henry met Nancy, and so I'm going to think, oh, are they working on literary elements right now? They're talking about the story. They're doing a little bit of retell of the story. And then there's Dr. Smith. I could focus a lot on Dr. Smith, even though he was a huge part of the story in that he helped Henry get to freedom. And we could talk about that. But I could also bring together this word, perhaps in the book that I'm reading later on. We're talking about slavery and the Underground Railroad and white people like Dr. Smith and Henry's Freedom Box who helped slaves like Henry get to freedom. And what word would describe that person? That person, sorry about that, is an abolitionist. So that's when I start talking and making those connections. Do you remember Dr. Smith and Henry's Freedom Box? He was an abolitionist. So bringing other text in and talking about text, I could do feelings because that would put my feelings together, and we could talk about what feelings Henry had at the beginning, the middle, and end of the story. I thought there was a happy here. Happy, sad, afraid. I could put happy with bird. At some point, I could talk about birds and symbolism. So a lot of things. Singing. Did you know, until it told us in the book, that slaves weren't allowed to sing in public? How do you feel about that? So playing with words, and again, have the pictures for the younger kids. Could I do a retell with this? Absolutely. So could I do a summary? Yep. So here I go, and I'm actually, a lot of you have probably seen this strategy to help students with the skill of summarizing. Now, see how I said that? The strategy, which is helping them with somebody wanted, but so then, with the skill of what? Summarizing. So somebody, Henry, wanted to be free, but he was a slave. So with the help of Dr. Smith, he mailed himself in a crate to Philadelphia. Then, after a long boat ride, now I could add more details. Well, how long of a boat ride? It was 20 some hours. Well, can we go back in the text and find the exact number of hours? He made it to the north. How do you know it was the north? Philadelphia was in the north and was free. Well, what does it mean to be free? Well, he had a birthday, so I could continue. Now, it wouldn't be a summary, but I could just say, well, how do you know? Why did you put this in there? And again, through questioning and just getting students to think and think about the text and think some more about the text is really what we want students to do. Again, a retell could be with pictures, and we're working up to summarizing, the skill of summarizing. Remember, some kids will be able to summarize, and some kids will need somebody wanted, but so then. What other mini lessons can be taught? We could talk about point of view, character traits, similes, which we did talk about a little bit, symbolism, theme, inferring using pictures. I want to say one of the things, Jen Jones from Hello Literacy, excellent literacy resource, excellent educator, mentor. But she talks about 5 different things you can infer through using pictures. And in the day of graphic novels, it's just, an amazing thing that we can teach our kindergartners, first graders to really look at pictures. And remember, if I'm reading a chapter book and an author decides to have a little sketch in there or an illustration or a picture, there's a reason. So what is that reason when we're talking about knowledge? All right, so let's take a deep breath. And I know we're getting to the end. I just want to show you a few strategies that are built on some current research and that have been published currently in the Reading Teacher. One is called the MVP strategy by Carolyn Strom. And again, students practice providing evidence for their thoughts and are guided to think critically about how specific language works. In this case, she decided to do an MVP, which we're thinking about most valuable phrase, where M relates to the main idea. V is a vivid image that phrase stuck with you. And P is, well, that phrase stuck with you. And if you notice, I have a number 1 here. There we go. Oops, sorry about that. The number 1 is because if you read this article, she is doing this and prompting and scaffolding for weeks to do this type of strategy with her students. And it's some pretty amazing reading for me as a person to read about how she does this with first graders. So here's my most valuable phrase, what I thought of. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. There I have some color coding just because it was in italics, and when we know when an author puts something in italics, even if it's like literary text, literature, a story, it's important. Why? Well, I think I picked that because later in the story, I'm talking about story structure, beginning, middle, end again, talking about just what the elements of the story. Many weeks passed. Oh, I'm using key ideas and details as well. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. And birds sometimes might signify that freedom. So why did I choose this? Because I really think it has to do with freedom. And Henry finally, so if I go back, when he saw that bird free bird, happy bird. He finally did something, and that's when he realized and looked at the crate and got the idea of mailing himself in a box. All right, so we're up to write purposefully. And again, I apologize that I am trying to go so quickly. There's just so much, and I could talk on and on forever, but I'm hoping that I'm giving you some tools to think about and to understand the importance of standards, understanding, know your books that you're reading, know those mentor texts inside and out, so you can make students experts at these texts as well. So you know you're comfortable going back and talking about that. So you basically have it memorized. What does the text say? How does the text work? What does the text mean? Yes, all those standards, and write purposefully. And notice I didn't even talk about the writing standards, because guess what? We want to get those ideas, all of those yummy, juicy, great things we've been talking about in our discussions. We need to start getting them down on paper. Using sentence frames, frame paragraphs, used for literal and inferential answers to support all students. And I urge you to have students write down, write about text at least daily, writing about text, their thoughts, their feelings, writing about a character, getting them used to writing their thoughts down. So when they have to write a lot, it'll be second nature, and it should be second nature by the time they enter that 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. All right, there's my favorite words and phrases. Again, I brought this up because talking about frame paragraphs and sentences and even essays I've done, you can use all these words and make it into a word box. And that's one way to help students. Remember, you can make it easier, you can make it harder. Differentiation at its best. The last thing I want you to talk about, why and how. Important. Why did you choose this? How does it relate? Why did you pick this? How does it relate to your claim, to your answer? And Wang, Matsumura, and Carenti 2016. I will link the article. They talk about making a case for complete, accurate, specific, and explained use of text evidence. And I encourage you K1, 2, 3 teachers to read this article as well, because you need to know what your students will be expected to know later on in their school years, because that's how we all, K1 through 5, K1 through 6, K1 through, or how we all, K through 12, support each other. Okay, so that's a lot of information. We didn't even touch on the other 2 vocab standards. However, I want you to get students discussing text, have students write about text, know your standards, and keep thinking, well, what does the text say? How does the text work? What does the text mean? And thank you so much for listening to me talk and talk and talk some more. And I hope that you can read some of these articles or just think about, how am I going to incorporate daily writing about text? Can I have, what kind of text, what books, picture books do I have, or other books that can be used as a mentor text? And don't forget if you're talking about, let's say, historical fiction, to build text sets of both informational text and literature, and vary up your genres, because we didn't even get to talk about genres. So incorporate poetry and all that fun stuff, which again, I could go on and on and on, but I hope you have a good rest of your day, and thank you again. Hi, it's me again. I forgot to give you today's session code, which is MLW06. Again, today's session code is MLW06. Thanks again for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.